Imagine coming back home after 3 weeks fighting pneumonia in the hospital, weak, exhausted, but relieved to finally be heading to your refuge, and finding strangers painting the walls of your house, saying they bought it from your son. That's exactly what happened to me, Margaret Wilson, 72 years old. While I was fighting to breathe in a hospital bed, my only son sold my house without consulting me, forged documents, and planned to put me in a nursing home to keep the money. The betrayal of an ungrateful son is something no mother imagines facing, but when it happens, you discover what you're truly capable of. This is my real story of how I lost everything and had to fight in court against the person I loved most in life. But to understand, I'll tell you how it all started. You know that moment when you think you're finally going back home, to your refuge, to the place where you built your entire life? That's exactly how I felt when I left that hospital after 3 weeks admitted with pneumonia. Margaret Wilson, 72 years old, finally free from those tubes, from that disinfectant smell that sticks to your skin. The nurse handed me a bouquet of white and yellow flowers, courtesy of the ward, they said, and I held it like it was a trophy, you know. I survived. I was going home. The taxi dropped me off at the corner because the driver said he couldn't get onto the street. There was a truck blocking the way. I didn't think much of it, grabbed my little suitcase and started walking down the sidewalk. I knew by heart every crack, every tree. But when I turned the corner and saw my house, that house where I'd lived for over 40 years, my heart simply stopped. There were people in the yard, strangers, painting the front walls with a color I'd never choose, light beige. I'd always liked the soft yellow that was there. My first reaction was confusion, you know? That feeling when you wake up in a strange place and it takes a few seconds to understand where you are. Did I take the wrong street? No, impossible. There was the rose bush I planted when Daniel was little, the gate with that slightly crooked latch I always said I'd fix. It was my house, without a doubt. But then, who were those people? I walked faster, my heart beating irregularly, the suitcase weighing on my arm like it had rocks inside. "Excuse me," I shouted, my voice coming out more shaky than I'd like. A man in his 40s came down the ladder, paint roller still in hand, and looked at me with that expression of someone being bothered. "Can I help you?" he asked, polite but distant. I pointed at the house, trying to form the words. This is my house. "What are you doing here?" The man exchanged a look with the woman beside him, and she was the one who answered, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This house is ours now. We bought it from your son." The words fell like bombs on my chest. Bought. From your son. My son, Daniel. My only son, whom I raised alone after I lost my husband, whom I watched grow up within those walls, who studied at that kitchen table. The bouquet of flowers slipped from my hand and fell to the ground, the petals scattering on the sidewalk like wreckage from a shipwreck. I felt my legs weaken, and if it weren't for the pole right there, I think I would have collapsed right then and there. The woman took a step toward me, concerned now. "Are you okay? Do you need to sit down?" But I couldn't answer. I could only stare at that house, my house, being painted, transformed, stolen. "There must be some mistake," I finally managed to say, my voice coming out as a whisper. "My son, he wouldn't do this, not without telling me. I'm coming back from the hospital, The man sighed, a bit awkwardly, and stuck his hand in his pocket, pulling out some folded papers. "Look, ma'am, we have all the documents here. Purchase and sale contract, everything proper, signed by Daniel Wilson. He said you were in agreement, that you wanted to move to a smaller place, more practical." Each word was a stab. Was in agreement? I didn't know anything about this. Nothing. People on the street started noticing what was happening. The neighbor next door, Mrs. Helen, came running out. "Margaret, you're back. I tried calling you at the hospital, but..." She stopped seeing my face. All the confusion. What's going on here? I couldn't even explain properly because I didn't understand it myself. "What do you mean Daniel sold my house? When? Why? And more importantly, how could he do this while I was fighting to breathe in a hospital bed, connected to machines without strength even to hold a glass of water?" I grabbed my cell phone with hands shaking so much I almost dropped it. I looked for Daniel's name in the contact list. Ironic, right? Ungrateful Son was saved as "My Love Daniel." I pressed call. Each ring seemed to last an eternity. "Answer, please. Explain this. Say it's a misunderstanding." But when he finally answered, his voice was too calm, too cold, like he was talking to a stranger who called during work hours. "Hi, Mom. Already out of the hospital?" And I, with my voice breaking, replied, "Daniel, there are people at my house saying you sold it. Please, tell me it's not true." While I waited for Daniel to give me an explanation that made sense, my mind went back in time. You know when you're in shock and memories start passing like a movie? I remembered when Daniel was born, that tiny baby who fit in my arm, looking at me with those innocent blue eyes. I always believed my only son was my greatest blessing, the reason for everything I did in life, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every penny saved. It was all for him, always for him. And now I was there, on the sidewalk, holding the phone, waiting for him to tell me this was a nightmare. I raised Daniel alone after I lost my husband in a car accident when the boy was only 5 years old. I remember like it was yesterday, the police officer knocking on the door at 2 a.m, me still in my nurse's uniform because I'd just gotten home from my shift. Life turned upside down that night. Suddenly, it was just Daniel and me against the world, you know? No family nearby, no support network, just the two of us. But I promised my husband, even though he wasn't there anymore to hear, that I'd give our son everything he deserved. I worked as a nurse in exhausting shifts, morning, afternoon, night, early morning, whatever came up. There were times I'd work double shifts, leave one hospital and go straight to another, sleeping about 2-3 hours a night. Daniel would stay with the neighbor, Mrs. Helen, who was always an angel in my life. I'd get home dead tired, but I'd always find the strength to make his dinner, help with homework, ask how school went. He was my priority, always. Even when my body begged for rest, I'd ignore it. Because being a mother is that, right? You give yourself completely. I saved every penny like it was the last on earth. I cut my own hair for years to avoid spending on salons. My clothes were always the same, mended, worn out, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that Daniel had new sneakers when his got too small, that he had quality school supplies, that he wouldn't be embarrassed in front of his classmates. I remember giving up health insurance to pay for his English course, working on holidays to save money for the summer camp he wanted so badly. I never complained, never made a point of letting him know the weight of it all. When it came time for college, I already had money saved, the fruit of years and years of obsessive saving. I paid for each semester of his business administration degree, each book, each fee. Daniel wanted to live on campus, so I found a way to pay for the dorm too, even though it meant taking on even more shifts. There was one Christmas I couldn't even buy a tree because the tuition payment had been late, but it was worth it, I thought at the time. My son was going to have a diploma, was going to have a stable future, was going to be someone in life. That was all that mattered to me. He graduated with honors, and I was there in the audience, crying with pride. I remember he thanked me in his speech. None of this would be possible without my mother, who sacrificed everything for me. Those words made me feel that every night shift, every skipped meal, every dream of mine left aside had been worth it. He got a good job right after, started earning well, married a woman who never looked at me with affection, but I swallowed her criticisms because I wanted Daniel to be happy. I always wanted the best for him, even when that meant accepting being treated as a second choice. But now, standing there on that sidewalk, seeing my house being painted by strangers, all that history of sacrifices seemed like a cruel joke. How many times had I given up traveling, enjoying my own life, doing something for myself, always thinking, it's for Daniel, it's for his future. And in the end, what did he see me as? An obstacle? A problem to be solved? I never imagined that one day he'd see me just as an obstacle to be removed from the equation of the perfect life he'd built. With the money and sacrifices I'd provided, the bitter irony hit me like a punch in the stomach. I'd raised the man who was now taking away the only place I called home. I'd worked myself almost to death to ensure he had a comfortable life, and now he was repaying me by selling my house behind my back while I fought to survive in a hospital bed. This is a real story, I thought. This is actually happening to me. This emotional story I always thought I'd have with my son, of love, gratitude, mutual care, had turned into something I couldn't even name yet. But one thing I knew, the betrayal I felt at that moment was worse than any physical pain the pneumonia had caused me. On the other side of the line, Daniel's silence lasted about 3 seconds, but I swear it felt like 3 hours. I could hear his breathing, calm, controlled, like he was carefully choosing each word he was going to say. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my neck, my temples, even in my fingertips. "Daniel?" I repeated, my voice coming out thin. "Please, son, tell me this is a mistake. Tell me these people are lying." I still wanted to believe, you know? I was still looking for a logical explanation, a justification that would make everything go back to normal. When he finally spoke, the coldness in his voice cut deeper than any knife. "Mom, you don't need that huge house. I already solved your life. Solved your life." The words echoed in my head like a slap. It wasn't, "We need to talk." It wasn't, "I was worried about you." It wasn't even an apology. It was a statement, just like that, as if he'd decided my life's fate while having breakfast. "What do you mean solved my life? Daniel, this is my house. You can't just sell it without asking me." He sighed on the other end, that sigh of someone dealing with a stubborn, difficult person. "Mom, stop being dramatic. You just got out of the hospital, you're getting old, you're not capable of taking care of a house this size alone. I did what's best for you. What's best for me." My hand squeezed the phone so hard, my fingers turned white. "You did this while I was hospitalized? While I was fighting to breathe, Daniel? How did you have the nerve?" My voice started rising, drawing attention from the new owners and the neighbor who was still there, mouth agape at the whole situation. That's when the truth started revealing itself, little by little, like layers of a lie being peeled away. "How did you sign the papers, Daniel? I need to sign the papers to sell my house." Another sigh from him, and this time I could feel the irritation. "Mom, I have power of attorney. You signed it years ago, remember? When you had to have knee surgery and asked me to take care of your things in case something happened." My God, the power of attorney. I vaguely remembered. It was for medical emergencies, for him to pay my bills if I became incapacitated. It never crossed my mind that he'd use it to sell my house. That was only for emergencies, for life or death situations, not for you to sell my house while I'm in the hospital. I was yelling now, tears starting to run down my face. Mrs. Helen held my arm, worried, but I barely felt her touch. All I could focus on was my son's cold voice on the other end of the line, the son I'd raised with so much love, for whom I'd sacrificed my entire life. "The power of attorney gives me the right to manage your assets, Mom." And that's exactly what I did. I managed. The word sounded so technical, so empty of emotion, that it made me nauseous. I realized at that moment that while I was in the hospital, connected to tubes and machines, fighting pneumonia that almost took me, he'd orchestrated everything. He'd forged my signature on documents or used that power of attorney illegally, whatever. The result was the same. He'd found buyers, negotiated prices, signed papers, and not once did he think it necessary to call me, ask me, consult me. I was just an inconvenient detail that needed to be managed. This elderly mother who dedicated 40 years of her life to him was now just another problem on his agenda. "And where do you think I'm going to live, Daniel? Answer me that." My voice had changed. It was no longer desperation. It was something colder, harder, anger starting to mix with the pain. He had a ready answer, of course. "I already researched some good nursing homes in the area. Places with structure, nurses 24 hours, activities for seniors. You'll like it, Mom. You'll make friends, have proper care. Nursing homes." He wanted to stick me in a nursing home. At 72 years old, perfectly capable of taking care of myself, he wanted to discard me like I was old furniture that doesn't work anymore. "Why did you sell my house, Daniel? What did you need that money for?" The question came out before I could think properly, but deep down I already knew the answer. I already knew my son, or thought I did. He hesitated for a second, and when he answered, the mask of filial concern fell off completely. "I have investments, Mom. Business opportunities. That money was just sitting there in the form of a house you barely use properly. It was more logical to liquidate the asset." Liquidate the asset. He was talking about my house, the place where I raised him, where I symbolically buried my husband, where I had every memory of my life, as if it were a stock on the stock market. At that moment, looking at those walls being painted by strangers, I finally understood. My son was no longer the boy I'd raised. He was an ungrateful son, driven by greed, capable of betraying his own mother in the cruelest way possible. I hung up on him, something I'd never done in my life. My hands were shaking so much the phone almost slipped and fell to the ground. The couple who'd bought my house looked at me with a mixture of pity and discomfort, not knowing what to do or say. It was the man who broke that awkward silence. "Look, ma'am, we didn't know anything about this. Your son assured us everything was fine, that you agreed to the sale." His voice was genuine. He seemed really uncomfortable with the whole situation. But that didn't change anything. My house had been sold, and I had nowhere to go. I swallowed my pride. And look, that hurt almost as much as everything else, and asked the question I never imagined having to ask. "Please, can you let me in just to get my clothes, my personal belongings?" The woman looked at her husband, and I saw in that look that they were uncomfortable, but they weren't going to refuse. "Of course," she said softly. "Most of your things are still there. Your son took some furniture, but the rest—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. I understood perfectly. Daniel had taken what had value and left the rest behind, like trash. Entering that house was one of the most surreal and painful experiences of my life. Each step was heavy, like I was walking in quicksand. The living room was empty, the sofa where I'd breastfed Daniel, the armchair where my husband read the paper every Sunday, the coffee table we bought on our honeymoon. Everything had disappeared. The walls had lighter marks where pictures had hung for decades. Family photos, paintings I got from my mother, everything ripped down, probably thrown away or sold for a few bucks. I felt like a stranger inside my own story, a ghost visiting a life that didn't exist anymore. In the bedroom, my bedroom, the scene was even worse. The bed was gone, the wardrobe too. My clothes were thrown in cardboard boxes leaning against the wall, as if they were donations for a thrift store. I knelt on the floor and started rummaging, looking for something, anything that still had meaning. I found the dress I wore at Daniel's marriage, wrinkled, smelling of mold. I found his childhood photo album, thrown carelessly in a box along with old towels. Each item I picked up was a new stab, a new layer of humiliation being added to that nightmare. Mrs. Helen had come in with me and was helping gather things. She didn't say anything, just carefully picked up the clothes and folded them, putting them in bags she'd brought from home. I could see the tears in her eyes, too. She knew my story, had seen me raise Daniel alone, knew about every sacrifice. At one point, she held my hand and squeezed, and that simple gesture almost made me completely fall apart right there. "You can stay at my house as long as you need, Margaret. You know that, right?" I nodded, unable to speak, because if I opened my mouth, only crying would come out. I found torn photos inside a trash can in the hallway. Photos of me with Daniel when he was a baby, when he graduated, when he got married. All torn in half, thrown away as if they meant nothing. Who had done this? Him? His wife? It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that it was clear I'd been erased, deleted from his life as if I'd never existed. I picked up the pieces and kept them in my pocket, in an inexplicable impulse to try to preserve something that was already destroyed long ago. Furniture sold, memories thrown away, everything discarded as if my entire life was worth nothing. It took me almost 2 hours to gather what remained of my things. Some clothes, important documents, personal objects that by miracle were still there. The new couple waited patiently, even offered help carrying the boxes to Mrs. Helen's car. They weren't the problem. I knew that. They were just ordinary people who'd bought a house without knowing they were in the middle of a family betrayal. But even so, seeing them there, owners of what was mine, hurt in a way I couldn't explain. It was like watching your own life being dismantled piece by piece while you're still alive to see it. When I finally left that house for the last time, carrying a box with some clothes and the patched photo album, I looked back. The house was still yellow, but it was already starting to turn beige. The rosebush in the yard was still there, indifferent to all that human pain. And I realized this wasn't just the loss of a house. It was the loss of trust in my own son. The loss of the illusion that family means something sacred. The loss of the naivety of believing that love and sacrifice are always reciprocated. The total humiliation of that moment, of being expelled from my own house while still weak from hospitalization, would be something I'd carry forever. But what I didn't know yet was that all that pain was about to transform into something different, into anger, into determination, into strength I didn't even know I had. I spent 3 days at Mrs. Helen's house, sleeping in her guest room, waking up in the middle of the night with my heart racing, still processing everything that had happened. She made chamomile tea every night, sat with me in the kitchen, and just listened. Didn't give advice, didn't judge, was just there. But I knew I couldn't run forever. I needed to look my son in the eyes and hear from him, personally, how he'd managed to do that. I needed to understand when exactly the boy I raised transformed into that cold, calculating man who sold his own mother's house while she fought to survive. On the fourth day, I called him again. This time, I was direct. We need to meet. Today. You owe me at least that, Daniel. He hesitated. I could feel it from the silence, but agreed. We arranged to meet at a cafe downtown, neutral territory. I spent the entire morning getting ready, trying to look stronger than I actually felt. I chose a blue blouse he'd given me as a Christmas present years ago. I don't know why. Maybe to remind him of times when we were still a real family, you know? Mrs. Helen offered to go with me, but I refused. This was something I needed to do alone. When I arrived at the cafe, he was already there, sitting at a corner table, messing with his cell phone with that relaxed posture of someone who had no guilt in their chest. He stood up when he saw me, made a motion to hug me, but I pulled back. I couldn't. Sitting in front of him was surreal. He was my son, had his father's face, the same blue eyes I looked at with so much love when he was a baby. But at the same time, he was a stranger, someone I didn't recognize anymore, who was capable of a cruelty I never imagined possible. He ordered a coffee for me without asking what I wanted. He always thought he knew what was best for me. "Mom, are you okay? How was the recovery?" The question came out automatic, procedural, the way you ask a coworker. There was no warmth, no genuine concern. I took a deep breath, trying to control my voice. "Daniel, how could you do this? Explain to me. Explain how you sold my house, the house where you grew up, where your father lived, where I built my entire life, while I was hospitalized, while I could have died." My voice failed at the end, but I didn't let the tears fall. Not yet. Not in front of him. He sighed, put his cell phone on the table and looked at me with that expression I'd seen before, the same one he used when he had to explain something obvious to someone he considered less intelligent. "Mom, I already explained. That house was too big for you. You're getting old. You just got out of serious pneumonia. What if it happens again? What if you fall and there's no one to help? I was thinking about your safety." Safety? The word sounded so false it almost made me laugh. "So you sold my house to protect me? Is that what you're telling me?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "Mom, I'll be honest with you. I needed that money. I have important investments, business opportunities that can't wait. That money was sitting there, not earning anything. It was better to use it for something productive." Ah, so that was it. Finally, the truth coming out without filters. It wasn't about my safety, never was. It was about his money, his investments, his life. I was just an inconvenient obstacle in the way of his financial prosperity. And the worst part, he wasn't even ashamed to admit this to my face. "And you think you had the right to do that? To decide what's best for me without even asking me?" My voice started rising, and some people at nearby tables looked, but I didn't care anymore. Daniel, however, cared. He always cared what others thought. "Mom, stop. You're making a scene." He looked around, embarrassed. "I have power of attorney. Legally, I had every right to do what I did. And about where you're going to live, I already researched some places. There's an excellent nursing home 20 minutes from here with all the structure you need." Nursing home. He kept insisting on this as if it were the perfect solution to all problems. "I don't want to go to a nursing home, Daniel. I want my house back. I want my life back." He shook his head, like someone dealing with a stubborn child. "The sale has already been completed, Mom. There's no going back. You need to accept this and move forward. I'll help you with the move to the nursing home. I'll pay the first few months until you adapt." He kept talking, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was just looking at that man in front of me, searching for some trace of the son I raised, some remnant of humanity, of remorse, of love. I found Daniel, but I didn't find my son. I found a different man, driven by greed and selfishness, justifying the unjustifiable with a disturbing calm. With a broken heart, I finally managed to articulate what I was feeling. "You didn't just take a house from me, Daniel." My voice came out low but firm. "You took the ground out from under my feet. You took away the security of knowing I had someone in the world who cared about me. You took away the illusion that I had a son who loved me." He opened his mouth to respond, but I got up from the chair before he could speak. I grabbed my purse, looked at him one last time and said, "I raised you alone, giving up everything, and you repaid me with the biggest betrayal I could imagine. I hope your investment is worth it, because you lost your mother today." And I left that cafe without looking back, knowing that conversation hadn't solved anything, but it had made one thing very clear. If I wanted justice, I was going to have to fight for it. The first weeks at Mrs. Helen's house were the hardest of my life. And look, I'd already been through a lot, from losing my husband young to raising a son alone with 2 jobs. But that pain was different, you know. It was a pain that came from within, that didn't get better with medicine or time. It was the pain of being betrayed by the person you loved most in the world. I slept in her guest room, on a comfortable mattress with nice-smelling sheets, but I woke up every night at 3 in the morning with my heart racing, sweating cold, reliving that moment on the sidewalk when I discovered my house wasn't mine anymore. The nights were long, endless. I'd lie there staring at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the living room clock strike the hours, and my mind wouldn't stop spinning. How had I not seen the signs? When exactly had Daniel changed? Was he always like this, and I was blind with maternal love? The questions came in waves, without answers, drowning me in doubts and guilt. Mrs. Helen would knock on the door sometimes, bring hot tea, sit on the edge of the bed and hold my hand. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence was already a comfort. But even with all her kindness, I felt like a burden, a weight, someone who no longer had a place anywhere in the world. During the day, I tried to keep myself busy so I wouldn't go crazy. I helped Mrs. Helen with the house, cooked, cleaned, did everything I could to repay her generosity. But deep down, I knew this couldn't last forever. It wasn't my house, they weren't my things, it wasn't my life. I'd become a refugee from my own existence, depending on a neighbor's charity while my son went on with his life, with my money in his pocket. The forced loneliness of that situation was suffocating. It wasn't just being physically alone. It was knowing that the person who should be by my side had put me in that position. One afternoon, I received a message from my daughter-in-law, Daniel's wife. It was short, almost insulting in its simplicity. "Found some more of your stuff in the garage. You can pick it up whenever." Not a hi, not an "I hope you're well," nothing. I didn't respond. I blocked her number and threw the phone on the bed with such force it bounced. Mrs. Helen was in the kitchen and heard the noise. "Everything okay in there?" I wanted to say yes, that everything was fine, but it wasn't. Nothing was fine. I collapsed right there, on the floor of the guest room, and cried like I hadn't cried since my husband's funeral. I cried for the lost house, for the destroyed trust, for the family that would never exist again. But it was in the middle of all that pain, in those sleepless nights and empty days, that something started to change inside me. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't a divine revelation or anything like that. It was gradual, like an ember that slowly gets hotter until it becomes fire. I was tired of crying, tired of feeling like a victim, tired of passively accepting that my life had ended at 72 because my son had decided so. And anger started to grow. Not that destructive anger that only hurts yourself, but a productive anger that gives you energy, that makes you want to fight. One night, I couldn't sleep again and went to the kitchen to make tea. Mrs. Helen appeared in her robe, yawning. "Another bad night?" I nodded, stirring the sugar in the cup with more force than necessary. She sat across from me and observed me for a while before speaking. "Margaret, you know you can stay here as long as you need. But I've known you for over 40 years, and this woman who's here in my kitchen isn't you. You've always been a fighter. Where did that nurse go who worked double shifts and still found energy to help others? That mother who raised a son alone without ever complaining?" Her words hit me like a slap in the face, the kind of slap we sometimes need. She was right. I'd spent my entire life fighting, overcoming obstacles, finding solutions, and now I was there, defeated, waiting for what? For Daniel to have an attack of conscience and give back my house? For life to magically go back to normal? It wasn't going to happen. If I wanted justice, if I wanted my dignity back, I was going to have to fight for it. No one was going to do this for me. I looked at Mrs. Helen, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something beyond pain and despair. I felt determination. "If he sees me as weak," I said, more to myself than to her, "he's going to find out what I'm capable of." That night, something fundamental changed. I was still afraid, still felt pain, still woke up scared at 3 in the morning. But now I had a purpose. I wasn't going to accept being discarded. I wasn't going to let Daniel get away with this emotional story of betrayal and greed. He'd taken my house. He'd humiliated me. He'd broken my heart. But one thing he couldn't take: my strength, my intelligence, my ability to fight for what was right. I didn't know yet how I was going to do this, what steps to take, but I knew one thing. This story was far from over. And this time, I wasn't going to be just the elderly mother who accepted everything quietly. I was going to be the woman Daniel had underestimated, and that was going to be the biggest mistake of his life. The next morning, I woke up with a purpose I hadn't felt in weeks. I took a shower, got ready, and asked Mrs. Helen to recommend a lawyer, someone good, someone who fought for justice and not just for money. She immediately mentioned Thomas Bradley, a community lawyer who had an office 2 blocks away. He helped my niece in a complicated inheritance case. He's good people, Margaret, honest. I called that morning and got an appointment for that same afternoon. While I waited, I organized all the documents I'd managed to save: the house deed, the power of attorney I'd given Daniel years ago, bank statements, everything that could be useful. Thomas's office was small, simple, without that intimidating luxury of expensive lawyers. He himself greeted me at the door, a man in his 50s, gray hair, genuine smile. "Mrs. Wilson, come in, please." He offered me coffee, had me sit in a comfortable chair, and just waited, unhurried. I started telling the story, and to my surprise, he didn't interrupt me once. He just listened, taking notes occasionally, nodding at specific moments. When I finished, I already had tears in my eyes again. But this time, they weren't just from pain. They were from relief at finally having someone listening, believing. Thomas was silent for a few seconds after I finished, looking at his notes. Then he raised his eyes and said something that changed everything. "Margaret, what your son did, it's not just morally wrong, it's illegal." My heart jumped. He continued, flipping through the documents I'd brought. "This power of attorney here was specific for medical and emergency financial matters. Selling a property doesn't fit that. And more, you were temporarily incapacitated by illness, but there was no judicial declaration of permanent incapacity. He didn't have legal authority to do this." We discovered there that Daniel had forged my signature on the sale papers, or at minimum used the power of attorney fraudulently. "So I can sue him? Can I get my house back?" The hope in my voice was palpable, almost desperate. Thomas took a deep breath, and I saw the hesitation on his face. "Yes, you can. We have solid legal basis to contest the sale. Fraud, forgery, breach of trust. There are several crimes there." But he paused, and my stomach tightened. There's always a but, right? The battle will be difficult. The buyer of the house is innocent in all this. He bought in good faith. He'll argue he didn't know anything, and it's probably true. He won't want to return the house easily. And cases like this can take time, can cost money. I looked at my hands, old, full of age spots, trembling slightly. How much time did I have? At 72 years old, after serious pneumonia, how many years did I have left to fight? But then I thought of Daniel, of his face in that cafe, of the coldness with which he'd justified everything. I thought of the humiliation of being expelled from my own house, of sleeping in a neighbor's guest room, of having been discarded like trash, and the anger came back, stronger. "It's not just about the house," I said, my voice firm now. "It's about my dignity. It's about showing my son that he can't do this to people, especially not to his own mother. However long it takes, whatever it costs, I don't care. I need to do this." Thomas smiled. Not that calculating lawyer smile, but a genuine smile of someone who recognizes courage when they see it. "Then let's fight, Margaret. Let's fight with everything we've got." In the following weeks, he worked tirelessly on the case. He got copies of the sale documents, identified the irregularities, prepared the initial petition. We discovered that the signature on the sale papers had been done electronically using the power of attorney, but that the document only allowed this in proven emergency cases, and selling a house definitely wasn't an emergency. Daniel had abused the trust, had manipulated the system, had committed fraud. The lawsuit was filed on a Friday morning. Thomas called me to confirm. "It's done, Margaret. Now it's a matter of time until Daniel is notified." I hung up the phone and sat on Mrs. Helen's porch, looking at the blue sky. feeling a strange mixture of fear and determination. I'd taken the first step. I'd stopped being a victim and started being a fighter. I didn't know how it was going to end, if I'd managed to recover my house, if the judge would believe me. But one thing I knew, I wasn't going to give up. Daniel had taught me that family doesn't always mean loyalty, that love isn't always reciprocated, that an ungrateful son exists and can be closer than you think. Still, the battle would be difficult. I was fully aware of that. The buyer of the house, that nice couple who'd let me get my things, didn't want to return it. They'd invested money, time, were already living there. They had rights too, even if innocent in the whole story. Thomas explained that the ideal would be to sue Daniel for damages, force him to return the money to the couple, and have them return the house to me. But that depended on Daniel having the money, on agreeing to pay, on 1,000 variables I didn't control. It was a path full of obstacles, uncertainties, sleepless nights thinking, what if I lose? But I'd decided, I'd rather lose fighting than accept defeat quietly, watching my son get away with one of the worst betrayals a mother can suffer. 4 months passed between filing the lawsuit and the trial date, 4 months that felt like 4 years. During that time, Daniel tried calling me several times, but I never answered. He sent messages saying I was overreacting, that this could be resolved within the family, that I was embarrassing him publicly. Each message only confirmed what I already knew. He had no remorse for what he did. He was only worried about his image, about the legal consequences. His gold-digger daughter-in-law also showed her face, sending a message saying I was destroying the family and that I should be ashamed of suing my own son. I blocked them both and moved forward. When the trial day finally arrived, I woke up at 5 in the morning even though the hearing wasn't until 10. I couldn't sleep, nervousness taking over every cell in my body. Mrs. Helen helped me choose my outfit, a navy blue suit, sober but elegant, that conveyed seriousness. You need to show the judge you're not a confused little old lady, she said while adjusting my collar. You're a lucid, capable woman who was the victim of a crime. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. I'd lost weight, had more wrinkles, but in my eyes there was something new. There was fire, determination, strength I didn't know existed. The courthouse was intimidating. Those gray walls, the smell of old paper and formality, people in suits walking hurriedly with stacks of files. Thomas was waiting for me at the entrance, greeted me with a firm handshake. Ready? I wasn't, but I said yes anyway. We entered the courtroom, and that's when I saw Daniel. He was sitting on the other side, in an impeccable black suit, next to a lawyer who looked expensive. Our eyes met for a second, and I swear I looked for some sign of regret, of pain, of something that indicated this was affecting him too. But I only saw irritation, embarrassment, as if I were an annoying problem he needed to solve. The judge entered, a man in his 60s, bald, serious expression, and everyone stood up. The hearing began with Daniel's lawyer speaking first, and every word that came out of that man's mouth was like distilled poison. He painted a picture of me as an elderly mother, confused, sick, incapable of taking care of her own life. He said Daniel had acted with love and concern, that he'd made a difficult but necessary decision to ensure my safety, that the power of attorney had been used within legality, that everything was documented, that I was just emotionally disturbed and therefore suing my own son. The total humiliation of hearing that was almost unbearable. When it was the lawyer's turn to finish, Daniel asked to speak directly to the judge. He stood up, adjusted his suit, and began his victim show. Your Honor, I love my mother. Everything I did was thinking of her well-being. She'd just gotten out of a serious hospitalization, was fragile, and that house was too big, dangerous for someone in her condition. His voice was firm, convincing. He'd always been good with words, always knew how to manipulate situations. I only thought of what was best for my mother. I never imagined she'd interpret my care as betrayal. He even put a hand on his chest in a gesture that would be comical if it weren't tragic. Then it was my turn. Thomas called me to testify, and my legs almost failed when I stood up. I sat in the witness chair, looked at the judge, not at Daniel. I couldn't look at him, and started speaking. I told about the hospitalization, about coming home and finding strangers there, about discovering it had been sold while I fought to breathe, about the power of attorney that was only for medical emergencies being used to sell my property. My voice trembled, But I didn't stop. I told about the 40 years I lived in that house, about raising Daniel alone there, about every sacrifice I made. And then, looking directly at my son for the first time, I said something I'd kept in my chest for months. I raised him to be an honest man. My voice came out stronger now, loaded with all the accumulated pain and disappointment. I worked double shifts to pay for his college. I gave up my dreams to fulfill his. He never lacked anything. Not love, not education, not values, or at least I thought he didn't lack them. I took a deep breath, feeling the tears starting to burn in my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. Today, I discover I raised my own enemy. A man capable of betraying me in the cruelest way possible, of taking away the only place I called home, of discarding me as if I were an inconvenient problem. And the worst part, he's not even ashamed of it. The silence in the room was absolute. Even Daniel's lawyer had stopped shuffling papers. I looked at the judge and saw he was observing me attentively, not with pity, but with respect. This lawsuit isn't just about a house, Your Honor. It's about dignity. It's about showing that an elderly mother can't be discarded just because she became inconvenient. It's about justice. I went back to my seat, legs shaky, and Thomas squeezed my shoulder lightly, a gesture of silent support. I glanced at Daniel, and for the first time since everything began, I saw something different on his face. It wasn't regret, but it was discomfort. The evidence was all there, clear as day: fraud, forgery, breach of trust. And the emotional story he'd tried to sell to the judge of a loving son protecting his mother was starting to crumble before the cold, documented facts that Thomas was presenting, one by one, without haste and without mercy. The judge asked for a 30-minute recess before giving the verdict, and that half hour was the longest of my life. I stayed in the courthouse hallway with Thomas and Mrs. Helen. She'd insisted on coming, saying I needed support. I couldn't stay still, paced back and forth, hands sweating cold. What if he decides in Daniel's favor? What if he thinks he was right? Thomas made me sit and held my hands. Margaret, the evidence is on our side. The judge saw everything. The misused power of attorney, the fraudulent sale, everything. Have faith. But faith was difficult after everything I'd been through, you know? Difficult to believe that justice really existed. When we returned to the courtroom, my heart was beating so hard I could hear the pulse in my ears. Daniel was there, talking quietly with his lawyer, and from the body language I could see he was still confident. He thought he'd get away with it, that his charm and well-crafted excuses would work. The judge entered. Everyone stood up, and when he began to speak, each word seemed to echo throughout the entire room. I've carefully analyzed all the evidence presented, heard testimony from both parties, and have reached a conclusion. He paused, looking directly at Daniel. The use of the power of attorney in this case was clearly abusive and fraudulent. I felt my heart jump, but I still couldn't completely believe it. The judge continued, his voice firm and emotionless. The power of attorney granted by Mrs. Margaret Wilson to her son clearly specified it was for medical emergency situations and temporary financial management during incapacity. Selling a property doesn't fit into any of these categories. Furthermore, Mrs. Wilson was not declared legally incapable by any medical or judicial authority. He looked at the documents in front of him, then raised his eyes again. Therefore, I declare the sales contract null and without legal effect. The property must be returned to the rightful owner, Mrs. Margaret Wilson. I couldn't hold it back. Tears started falling, but this time they were tears of relief, of victory, of justice finally being done. Mrs. Helen hugged me tight, and I could feel her trembling too. Thomas smiled discreetly, organizing papers with that professional satisfaction of someone who'd won a difficult case. But the judge wasn't finished yet. In addition to returning the property, Mr. Daniel Wilson is ordered to pay all court costs, attorney fees, and compensation for moral damages to his mother in the amount of $50,000. The figure was high, substantial. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the message being sent. I looked at Daniel and saw his face turn red, not from shame, but from anger. He turned to his lawyer and started saying something quietly, agitated, but the lawyer just shook his head, defeated. The judge banged the gavel. Case closed. Possession of the property must be transferred back to Mrs. Wilson within a maximum of 30 days. The couple who bought the house in good faith will be reimbursed by Mr. Daniel Wilson for the full amount paid, plus moving costs and inconveniences. It is recorded and filed. Done. It was done. I'd won. I had my house back. I had my dignity back. I'd proven that an elderly mother isn't disposable, no matter what ungrateful sons think. Daniel got up abruptly from his chair, without looking at me, and went straight to the door. His lawyer ran after him, trying to say something, but Daniel just made brusque gestures with his hands, visibly furious. His wife was waiting in the hallway. I saw when I passed by, and the two of them started arguing right there, not caring who was watching. She was furious with him, probably calculating how much this would cost, how much of his investments would have to be used to pay me. They walked away without even looking in my direction, unable to face the shame of what they'd tried to do, and failed miserably. When I left the courthouse, the sun was shining outside, and I know it sounds cliché, but I swear I'd never seen the sky so blue, so beautiful. I took a deep breath, feeling the air entering the lungs that had almost stopped working months ago because of pneumonia. I'd survived the illness, and I'd survived the betrayal. I'd fought against my own son, and won. Thomas shook my hand. Congratulations, Margaret. You deserved every second of this victory, and I really deserved it. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted justice. Because no mother should go through what I went through. No person should be discarded by their own family, as if they were worth nothing. With tears in my eyes, but good tears this time, I felt such deep relief that my legs almost failed. I was going back to my house. I was going to sleep in my room, take care of my garden, live my life the way I always wanted. Of course, the house would need some adjustments. The couple had changed some things, painted the walls, but it was a small price to pay. The important thing was that it was mine again, legally, officially. No one could take that from me now. But at the same time, looking back as we walked away from the courthouse, I also felt the pain of losing my son to his own greed. Daniel had chosen money instead of me. He'd chosen investments instead of love. And that choice had consequences he'd carry for the rest of his life. Not just financial, but the weight of knowing he'd betrayed his own mother and lost. It took exactly 27 days for me to be able to return to my house. The couple who'd bought it was extremely understanding when they learned the whole story. They were shocked, said they never would have bought it if they'd known about the fraud. Daniel had to return every penny they paid, plus moving costs, and from what I heard, he had to sell his car to raise all the money. I'm not going to lie, feeling a little bit of satisfaction about that didn't make me a bad person, just made me human. When I finally put the key in my door lock and entered, the smell was different. The walls had another color, but it was my house, my home, and no one was going to take that from me ever again. The first months were about reconstruction, both of the house and of myself. I painted the walls back to the soft yellow I'd always loved, bought new furniture with part of the compensation Daniel had been forced to pay. I put family photos back on the walls, except his, those I stored in a box in the attic, not out of anger, but because it hurt too much to look at that face and remember everything that had happened. Mrs. Iand. Helen came to dinner with me every week, and gradually other neighbors started showing up too. The story had spread through the neighborhood, and many people stopped me on the street to say I'd been brave, that I'd done the right thing. It was during one of those dinners with Mrs. Helen that the idea came up that would change everything. We were talking about loneliness, about how many elderly people in the community lived alone, abandoned by their families, without anyone to talk to or share meals with. "You know what you should do with this big house?" she said, taking a piece of pie. "Turn it into a meeting place, a community space for people like us, people who've been through abandonment, who need company, purpose." The idea hit me like lightning. It made complete sense. I'd been through the hell of being discarded by my own family. How many other people were going through the same thing and suffering in silence? In the following months, I renovated the living room and transformed it into a cozy space with comfortable sofas, a large table for community meals, shelves with books and games. I put an ad in the local church and community center, open space for elderly people seeking companionship and friendship, every Wednesday and Saturday from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. Coffee, conversations, and welcoming. At the first meeting, 5 people showed up. The next week, 10. In 2 months, I had a fixed group of 15 elderly people who came regularly, each with their story of abandonment, of loneliness, of ungrateful sons who'd forgotten that parents also need love and attention. I met Martha, an 80-year-old lady whose 3 children lived in other states and never called. I met George, a 75-year-old widower who hadn't seen his grandchildren in 5 years because his daughter-in-law didn't allow it. I met Susan, who'd been put in a nursing home against her will by her daughter who wanted to keep her pension. Each story was a punch in the stomach, but at the same time, it was comforting to know I wasn't alone, that this pain of family abandonment was more common than I imagined, and together we became stronger. There I found new friendships, genuine laughter, and a sense of purpose that went far beyond the pain Daniel had caused. The story spread through the city. A local newspaper did a piece about me. Elderly mother transforms tragedy into mission of help. I was a bit embarrassed by all the attention, but at the same time, it was important. Important to show that aging doesn't mean being disposable, that elderly people have value, have stories, still have life to live. Donations started arriving. More comfortable chairs, board games, even a new television. The community embraced the project, and that house that had almost been stolen from me transformed into a sanctuary for people who, like me, had faced abandonment and needed to feel seen, heard, valued again. Daniel never tried to contact me again. I heard through others that he and his wife moved to another state, probably running from the shame, from the judgmental looks, from the scandal of having tried to rob his own mother. Part of me still heard about that, still hoped for a call, an apology, some sign that the son I'd raised still existed somewhere in there. But another part, the part that had grown through all this, had made peace with the loss. Though the wound with Daniel would never completely heal, I'd learned that family isn't just blood. Family is who stays, who cares, who shows up when you need them. 1 year after the trial, I was sitting on my house's porch on a Saturday afternoon, watching the group of elderly people chatting animatedly in the living room. Martha was teaching George how to crochet, and they both laughed at his clumsy attempts with the needle. Susan was helping in the kitchen, preparing cookies that filled the house with that good cinnamon smell. Mrs. Helen showed up with an apple pie, as she always did. I looked around and realized I'd lost a son, but I'd gained an entire family. I'd lost the illusion that blood guarantees loyalty, but I'd gained the certainty that dignity is earned by fighting, not by accepting. I held my head high with pride, breathing in deeply that air of freedom that only those who fought for justice know. I discovered that my true strength was never in the walls of the house Daniel tried to steal, but inside me, in the courage to not accept being discarded, in the determination to fight even when every bone in my body ached from exhaustion and age. This emotional story of betrayal and overcoming had transformed me, not into someone bitter, but into someone stronger, more compassionate, more aware of my own value. And every Wednesday and Saturday, when that house filled with laughter and stories of people who'd been abandoned but who now had a place to call home, I knew I'd found my true purpose, not just surviving betrayal, but transforming it into something that helped others survive too. In the end, I discovered that true strength was never in the walls of my house, but inside me. I lost a son to greed, but I gained an entire family made of people who understand the value of loyalty and respect. Justice was done, but the scar of betrayal still hurts, and it probably always will. But I learned that aging doesn't mean being disposable, and that fighting for your own dignity is worth every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of pain. And you, have you ever gone through something similar with someone from your own family? Have you ever had to face betrayal from someone who should protect you? What would you do if you were in my place? Share your story in the comments. Sometimes sharing these experiences is the first step toward healing. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss other emotional stories that bring life lessons and make us reflect on our own choices and relationships. See you in the next video.